Welcome back to Zenith Poker. In this tutorial, we'll be looking at small blind versus big blind, single raise pot, and we'll be focusing on the connected high boards, and we'll be looking at some of the turn and river runouts that change the board. So first up, we'll look at some of the straight completing runouts, as in completing a 4 straight. We'll look at some of the flush completing runouts, and we'll look at some runouts which pair the board. So let's have a look. We'll start off with this King Queen 10. That seems interesting. And we can focus on a few different lines, but mainly sort of the small bet line, which we saw was quite common on these high connected high boards. Small bet call, and we'll look at the turn report and we'll see what exactly is happening to the EV of the out of position player, the small blind. So the small blind's EV increases when the jack comes. So it's increasing when it's relatively high up in terms of the number of, in terms of the EV out of all the hands. When the jack comes, and then when the flush comes, it's relatively low. So the average is 4.37 after it goes bet call. The jack increases it here to 4.56, but on the other hand, the spade decreases it, and then ace seems to decrease it as well. So jack completes the 4 straight, specifically the 4 straight with the ace. So you're going to have King, Queen, 10, and Jack. So the ace basically will complete Broadway, and the small blind is going to have a fair amount of ace X in the betting range. So let's have a look at that. Jack of clubs. Change the display method there to make it easier, and we'll change to percentages. As we can see, on the Jack, all right, we've got a 4 straight, King through 10, and the straight is either an ace or a 9. And out of the small blinds betting range on the flop, 52.7% of that range is now a straight. It doesn't say quite how much is the ace straight and which is the 9 straight, but as you can see, there's a lot more ace straight than there is 9 straight. So what happens is when the straight comes in, like this, and the ace completes the straight, it's fairly easy for both players to have a straight. Betting too big would mean that your opponent would only continue with the ace straight, right? Noticing here that if, say for example, you bet twice the pot here's 9, if you bet twice the pot, the in-position player basically only continues with the ace. It's very difficult to actually come up with any bluffs that can really outdraw this, and it's really quite difficult there. Even a pot size bet basically means that you're continuing with the ace straight, you're unfolding all the 9 straight without a flush draw, and you're just continuing with 2 pair that can draw to a boat if the board pairs. All these flush draws either have one of those pairs or are a straight, the 9 straight. Betting big is a bad idea just because the in-position player has a lot of straights as well. They're 45.8%. So the idea is to bet small, right? You're betting small with a lot of the ace, a lot of the 9, and you're trying to get called by worse. So even if you bet half the pot, you're betting half the pot. What is the value component of this range? The value component is basically just the ace straight. Betting half the pot is actually a fairly big bet in this run out. Here, these sets are being used as semi-bluffs. If the board pairs on the river, you've made a boat and you've outdrawn your opponent straight. And your opponent's quite likely to have a straight after you make this half pot bet and they call. And then there's a few other hands here which are basically just used as kind of airball bluffs. The main bluffs are these flush draws, pair plus flush draws, these flush draws down at the bottom of the matrix there. Otherwise, you're betting here this quarter pot. And now this quarter pot is a combination of the ace straight and the 9 straight. So you're betting both of those hands here, the ace straight and the 9 straight, and the value component of the range is 61.3%. So fairly value heavy, and it's value heavy because of the small bet size. Can't really be bluffing too much. You bet small, sometimes you're going to get raised, and this raise size is all in. Basically, what is it saying? Any of these ace straights with a flush draw will jam in combination with the ace straight with the flush draw, with the nut flush draw blocker, to basically try to make your remaining ace straights indifferent between calling and folding. That's a pretty nice touch there. Bet another quarter pot, and then call river brick, betting quarter pot again. These very small sort of bet sizes. If you end up getting raised to the weird size here on the turn, like a pot size raise or even a half pot size raise. But so this pot size raise, yet you're folding the 9 straight. You're only continuing with the ace straight and the sets. So yeah, don't be afraid to bet small and then fold that bottom end of the straight when it's four in a row like that. Let's have a look at another flop just so we get hammering that sort of point. Yeah, we'll look at king 3-9. So king 10-9. We'll have a look at the check line this time. So when it goes check, look at the turn report. When it goes check, for the out position player, their checking range is going to be much weaker than the betting range. But when it goes check, check, which of the turn cards I'm looking at that complete the 4 straight? So there's the queen there, some of the jack, there's some queens down there, some jacks up here. Really in between for both players. Doesn't really favor one player or another. So let's have a look at that. So say for example, we get the jack of diamonds, which brings in a flush draw. After it goes check, jack of diamonds comes in. Now, neither player has too many straights, right? Because a lot of those straights would have been put into the betting ranges on the flop. Say for example, quarter pot call, the jack comes as 25.2%, 23.6%. Check bet call, the jack comes 29.9%, 33.6%. So when it just goes check, check, the frequency of the straight in both players' ranges isn't super high. And by the straight, it's just the queen, because there's only the queen and ace queen being the nut straight, and then just queen x being the second straight. So when there's only one straight compared to 2 possible straights, or another way of thinking about when it's a gut shot straight versus an open-ended 4 straight on the board, the number of straights in both players' ranges is going to be changing a lot. And now because there's not that many straights in other players' range, after a jack on the flop, the bet size is going to be slightly bigger. Obviously, betting too big, say for example, you bet 3 times a pot. Yeah, if you bet 3 times a pot, then basically they're just only continuing with a straight and 2 pair to try to draw to a set, and then these top pairs here are flush draws. So it's pretty easy to defend against these very big bets. If there's a 4 straight on the board, you basically just continue with straights, 2 pairs, and other pairs that have really good equity, such as a flush draw. And sometimes you do have to bluff catch when the bet isn't super big. So for example, there's a pot size bet, but this 2 pot size bet is pretty easy to defend because you're just selecting straights to continue, 2 pairs to continue, which can draw to a boat, and basically any of these pairs with some sort of flush draw, redraw to the stronger straight. For example, here this ace jack can draw to a queen and then suddenly has become Broadway. So here this half pot size bet, and quarter pot size bet. Half pot size bet, a lot of the queen x. There's also the 8-7 straight, which I forgot to say about, but that 8-7 straight's only a few different combinations. Quarter pot size bet, a lot more of this 8-7. Now, because both players don't have as many straights as on the previous board that we looked at, there's more value betting of hands like 2 pair. Trips would have bet the flop a lot of the time, so all these just 2 pairs now. And a lot of those 2 pairs would have been made with a jack. All this jack 10, jack 9, king jack. Those 2 pairs there, and then the remainder of the S's. And even some of these top pairs will bet and then try to get the showdown. So say for example, quarter pot bet, call as a brick. You got these top pairs here betting very small again to try and get called by a weaker pair. And if there's a stronger hand, that's going to raise you anyway. Or half pot, call. Now a lot of these top pairs are checking, with the exception of ace king, still betting small, but a lot of them are checking. So that's how this top pair plays in this check, the straight comes line. You can bet small a couple of times in order to get called by a weaker pair. So don't be afraid when you're out of position to make these small sort of block bets, because if you check, your opponent's going to be betting their straight into you anyway. So they're straight in 2 pairs into you anyway. So betting small, getting called by worse, while also if you get raised and you're like indifferent and you're saying to be indifferent. So for example, bet call and then bet river, you get raised. All these top pairs are indifferent. So say for example, we look at the half pot bet line, half pot bet, right? So what kinds of bluffs are you going to be using on this kind of board? So a lot of this is ace high. So ace high, if the queen comes, you made Broadway. So that's pretty nice. And then some of the flush draws is the main thing. There's some other stuff you can throw in there, like a random jack, in pocket twos. These kinds of hands all your bluffs should be having some draw equity against your opponent in some sort of way. The jack is difficult to say whether it's a bluff or a value bet. It's very much in between at that stage. There's the jack 8. There's the jack 8. Jack 8 is nice because when the 7 comes, it's got a straight as well. So it can outdraw some 2 pairs. So betting here, quarter pot, call. Sorry, half pot call, and now you're on the river. All the top pairs are now checking. Different in the quarter pot line where all the top pairs are still betting quarter pot. And now you've got a few different bet sizes on the river. After this sort of filter on the flop in this half pot bet call line, both players are going to have much more straights. So say, for example, here in position is going to have 23.2, out of position is going to have 28.1. There's the ace queen being played passively, going for the check raise all in. So check, bet here, and then just rip it in with ace queen to try and make your opponent straights indifferent. So that's the way you can play ace queen, or betting small and you get raised, you just rip it in. The only thing it doesn't do is it doesn't bet big, because if it bets big, you're just ripping a queen, and it doesn't really make sense for your opponent to raise any of their queen X into you, because ace queen would just rip it. So that's why, like, if you make this pot size bet, these hands are indifferent even though it doesn't make sense. It's just a nonsense line because you don't really have ace queen. The reason why this particular set of hands is making a small raise without any bluffs is to try to make ace queen somewhat closer to indifferent between betting the small size and then betting this big size. But ace queen doesn't make sense to bet in this big size because it's too queen X heavy. When it's too queen X heavy, the other player's not going to raise the queen X. So with ace queen, you're going to want to be putting it into a smaller size or checking, because then your opponent will bet their queen X and then you just rip it into them. So say, for example, here with these 2 pairs, is betting like half pot. Some of these straights are raising, and then the queen X ace queen jams with the rest of the queen X. And because you're trying to fold your opponent off the chop, you need a lot of bluffs to make your opponent indifferent. So that's why there's that bluff to value ratio, ace queen being nuts. So when you have the nuts here, ace queen, try to make sure that you can try to stack your opponent's queen X by putting in a line which basically gets your opponent to bet or raise you with their queen. But if you put it into the rest of your queen X, then it's not going to go well for you because your opponent is not going to raise. And obviously, if you bet too big on the river, your opponent can just only continue with a straight sets and some of the 2 pairs. So you're not really getting enough value when you've got a straight yourself, so you can't bet too big. Check, face a half pot bet, and then basically, I think we looked at this earlier, check jamming all the queen X. I mean, there's a little bit of just this other random airball stuff, which is jamming as well. I don't expect too many people to be able to find that, but like it's blocking these weaker queen X's here. It's an interesting bluff jam candidate. But when you're trying to fold your opponent off a chop, you do need a lot of bluffs in order to do that. Okay, I'm conscious of time. Let's just look at one more straight completing run out. And then in the next video, we'll look at some of the flush and paired cards, just because I think straight completing runouts are relatively interesting, and a lot of players will play them wrong. So we haven't looked at the ace-x versions yet, so let's do that now. So look at this one, ace-jack 10. Okay, so ace-jack 10, the flop straight is the king-queen. And on this flop, there's going to be a lot of top pairs or 2 pairs. So here, ace-queen, ace-jack, so ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, ace-10. They're all basically betting at very high frequency. And that's fine. Like ace-king and ace-queen, they're both pretty nice to bet, because when the ace or the king comes, you've either made the straight or you've made very strong 2 pairs. It's a pretty nice hand to be betting. Bet size half pot, 3/4 pot. Betting too big on the flop isn't so good, because you basically only get your opponent to continue with the king-queen, all their 2 pairs themselves. All the top pairs are basically just starting to fold off now. So don't bet too big on the flop. Here, even betting like 3/4 pot still gets your opponent to call all the top pairs, and then some of the middle pairs and weaker pairs are starting to fold, depending on whether they've got the additional draw or backdoor draw. They're jack 6 with the backdoor flush draw, continuing over the jack 5, etc. So it's important to know when to be folding middle pairs on the flop. Otherwise, you're going to be floating too many hands on boards like this if you're the big blind here. When you're facing this 3/4 pot bet and this board just in general smashes the small blind's range in terms of equity, you do want to be overfolding by a fair amount. Okay, so let's have a look at this 3/4 pot line. We'll look at the turn report again. The queen's being pretty nice for the small blind. The flush draw, not so nice for the small blind. And the jack is somewhere in between. There's one jack there. The other jacks down there. So the jacks aren't quite as good. So let's have a look. Sorry, what am I talking about? Jacks. I'm talking about kings. Yeah, kings aren't quite as good. Queen's pretty good. So let's have a look at the queen. Queen of clubs. So really good. Brings a lot of the straight, this king X. And you can see there's going to be some difficulty calling all this king X and queen X here. But all this king X is going to be having difficulty just floating. So all of these king X are just naked, right? And naked king X facing a 3/4 pot bet on the flop is difficult. So there's not going to be a lot of them, nowhere near as much. So there's all the king X there, and there's also the 9/8. So there's two straights, the 9/8 straight and the king X straight. The in-position player's got slightly more 9/8 than the out-of-position player. So small blind's got a lot of king X. Big blind's got slightly more 9/8, although king X is the dominant straight here. Once again, as previous, if you end up betting too big, right, even like these over bets are just being cut off because they're so bad. But if you bet too big, your opponent can just continue with straights and two pairs. So it's pretty easy to continue against these big bets when the straight completes. Don't be afraid to just snap fold an ace against a pot-sized bet on a 4 straight board. Two pairs on the other hand, like two pairs are very indifferent. And like you're really only calling them to draw to a boat. So if you think your opponent's under bluffing when they make a pot-sized bet, then you can just fold 2 pair as well. Some slight differences, and maybe if you got a flush draw, or even some of these weaker flush draws are starting to fold against this big bet, so you don't even have to continue all your flush draws. So the main sizes here are this half pot, quarter pot, so smallish sizes. In this half pot line, a lot of the king X, fairly king X heavy, and then in the quarter pot line, you've got some 2 pairs and some top pairs in there as well. These top pairs are really quite thin. So for example, you bet quarter pot, you're folding out a chop. So you're folding out a chop sometimes. So it's quite mergy, a little bit of an out of position block bet. If you bet quarter pot here and then you see the river, like all your top pairs is basically just checking, and then you're hoping your opponent checks back their own top pair, middle pair hands. But if your opponent bets into you, all your top pairs are basically just folding or hero calling. Don't be afraid to make this small bet with a top pair when you're out of position, because if you checked, right, your opponent's going to be betting a straight and 2 pair into you anyway. And even in like the check line, you've got top pair, you're going to be checking it again, and your opponent's basically going to be betting all their 2 pair into you. So the EV ends up being pretty close between making this small bet. And if you don't make this small bet with your top pairs, your checking range is going to be too top pair heavy. So your opponents can try to exploit that by betting slightly more frequently with, say, for example, a straight and 2 pair. Because, say, for example, you just bet a lot of this straight at the same frequency, all the 2 pairs at the same frequency, but all these top pairs checked, your opponent would be betting more often into you. And just to illustrate that, I guess we could node lock it. So, for example, we just node lock it to check all of this top pair. Right. Let's run that again. So now all of these top pairs with nothing else are just being checked. All right, let's stop it there. Check, and now you just bets everything into you. So yeah, that's what happens when you've constructed your checking range to be too middling. So you end up with basically your opponent being able to basically just bet everything into you, and like even your opponent's just betting a lot of these their top pairs into you, because like your top pairs are just indifferent. I mean, your top pairs were indifferent anyway, but if you had bet, you can get your opponent to fold out their top pairs, right, etc. Yeah, and now we'll take a look at the big blind's response if you don't have any of the top pairs in this small bet range. Like the big blind's just going to be folding a lot of these top pairs now, and notice they're not folding too much more than previously. Just the absence of the top pairs in the small bet range means your opponent can fold quite a bit more. They're also raising less as well. All right, let's unlock that and get back to our equilibrium, or roughly our equilibrium. All right, close enough. Yeah, well, the top pair's betting small again. Now in the small bet line, your opponent's top pairs are now indifferent. That's how you're getting your opponent to be indifferent with those hands. If you're here in the big blind in a spot like this, and your opponent isn't making these small bets with top pairs, and you can just fold all the top pairs and middle pairs yourself because your opponent will be under bluffing. Here in this case, this quarter pot bet is a bluff of some sorts with the top pair. Not clearly a bluff, it's not clearly a value bet, but it makes your opponent's middling hands too easy to get away on that sort of flop. And you're probably not going to be bluffing these other candidates such as these weaker pairs. All right. So now let's look at the half pot lines. Half pot, that's fairly straight heavy. It's got some of the two pairs in there, even some top pairs and middle pairs. Bet half pot, call. The straights just calling, right? If a lot of the straights raise, then on the river, there's going to be, the small blind is going to be betting very frequently. So say, for example, here, after this half pot bet, all the straights will raise. We can have a look at that just with a bit of no locking. Raising some more of these straights with a flush draw, for example. We'll just raise some of these like that and then rerun it. And notice I'm not raising all the straights, but just some of them. If that happens, then on the river, the straights are basically just potting it into the opponent because there's not enough straights to really defend. And so your opponent has to defend with other hands. If we do that with even more straights, for example, add some more straights just to see how the progression goes. And then we'll look at the sizes as well. There you go. So went from pot size to twice the pot. Just not having enough straights to defend. And then, say for example, they just raise all the king x straight like that. Pretty easy to play. After it goes bet call, just jam the river. And notice here also that the more your opponent raises the straights, the more you want to bet because when they call, their range is very weak. So yeah, just watch out for that. If your opponents are raising too many straights in position, then it's pretty easy to bet. And then when they call, their range is so weak, you can basically pick up the pot by just ripping the straight yourself and then value betting some other hands and you don't have to worry about a straight after it calls the turn. So you end up getting really nice river play that way. Getting back to equilibrium on this street, roughly. Not too many of the straights are raising. Then after it goes bet call, the straights are just betting sort of half pot, right? Because in position's got a lot of straights and you're going to want to get some value from hands weaker than a straight, such as two pair and top pair. And then the hands which come in for a bluff are basically just all these air balls. Missed 9x and 8x straight draws from the previous street, because a lot of those gut shots down here would have wanted to basically bluff. And these hands make a decent bluff candidate because they don't really block anything, and you are gonna need quite a few bluffs. So even a jack is turning itself into a bluff, pocket 3 is turning itself into a bluff, queen X is turning itself into a bluff. So it's a lot of hands weaker than top pair turning themselves into bluffs here. Like in this sort of line, if your opponents aren't really making those bluffs with these sorts of hands, weak pairs, middle pairs, all these missed hands here, then it's going to be pretty easy for you to just fold all your two pairs, top pairs. Okay, so we're very over time. But yeah, hopefully that gives you some better idea about how to be playing these connected high boards when the straight comes in. And we looked at some potential exploits that you can do when the straight comes in. And so in the next video, we'll keep going with connected high because I want to cover what happens when the flush comes in, what happens when the board pairs. So we'll be looking at that next time. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye now.